And this is an aspect of this discussion that I believe many who support the positive representation solution are either intentionally neglecting or simply haven't considered, because they believe that their idea of positive representation is the idea of positive representation. Alright, so it happened. Somebody actually made a response to my video on representation. And I have to say that they did a pretty awesome job. This response, although it was made in disagreement, was in no way rude, dismissive, or disparaging. They did exactly what I asked. Their critique felt like it was made in good faith and with no ill intent towards either myself or my arguments. And so before I get into my actual response, I just want to take a second and offer a truly heartfelt thank you to Christian Verstappen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, his video is an hour and 24 minutes long, so I'm going to split my response up into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to address what I believe is the fundamental difference between our modes of thought. This is the hypothesis that I believe every other counterpoint he makes in his video stems from. And honestly, I think that addressing that main point would suffice. However, for whatever reason, I do feel compelled to address some of the other points that he made in his response. So that's going to be part 2 of this video, addressing many of the other individual claims that were made throughout his video. Now again, his video is 1 hour and 24 minutes long, so I probably won't be able to respond to each individual point. And so I'm going to link his full video in the description below. And if you have the time, please go and check it out in its entirety so that you can get the full context of his argument. Obviously, I'll do my best not to misrepresent him in this video, but the best way to truly understand his argument is to get it from him directly. So again, I just want to say another thank you to Christian. But with all that said, let's just get into the discussion. Do you believe that media should have the power to determine the limits of the human beings that engage with their stories? Personally, I don't believe that the media should have that power at all.
Okay, this is it. This is it right here. So it's not about whether or not the media should have that power. I agree that it shouldn't. But there are a lot of systems and such in place that shouldn't have a certain amount of power in our life that just do.
Okay, so first off, I'm glad that we agree that this power should not be in the hands of the media. This is an extremely important aspect of this conversation, so I do not want to gloss over this. So let's just establish that insofar as the media has the power to influence our perceptions of ourselves and others, you and I agree that this authority is unwarranted. Again, this is very important and will be a consistent theme in this discussion. So I just want to make sure to place the necessary amount of emphasis on this point. But anyway, you then go on to say,
we can't live in the world of just how we would like it to be, as far as, oh, this shouldn't affect us, that shouldn't, like, these things shouldn't matter, however you want to, any of that. Like, it doesn't matter how it should be, it matters how it is.
Okay, so I disagree with the notion that you cannot focus on how things should be while also taking into account how things actually are. I believe that my solution, which again isn't really mine, so I guess I should say, I believe that the combination of already proposed solutions that I just compiled and presented actually do address how things are while also moving us in the direction of how you and I agree things should be. Again, just as a reminder, the solution that I presented involves addressing the systemic issues in Black and other minority communities that keep these areas isolated and impoverished. I understand that this has already been in the works for centuries. So all I'm really saying is that I believe our focus should remain in this arena and not the representation ideal. Because once the avenues of success are opened up for these communities, they won't need to see representations of themselves achieving this success in media, since they would already hold the understanding that they are capable of reaching those heights, since their friends and family members have already done so. Similarly, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but the wider audience won't need to see these minorities represented in these contexts either, because this reality will already be reflected in their daily lives. And in the meantime, as it pertains to media, I did already endorse the push for the diversification of storytelling in my original videos, albeit for very different reasons. I do concede, however, that in the meantime, there absolutely should be more stories told about minority populations across the globe. I mentioned this in my first video about representation, but diversifying the types of stories being told will only benefit everybody involved in the storytelling industry, giving previously disregarded groups the opportunity to be the leaders of these tales while telling stories that convey different ideals, principles, and messages from what we've seen before. And so this combination of actionable steps, in my opinion, adequately addresses your concern for focusing on how things actually are by actively making an effort to tell more minority-focused stories, which will inherently increase representation without any of the hypocrisy involved in the current arguments supporting it, while also moving us in the direction of how things should be by steadily stripping away the undue influence that media has over us. And I would argue that yours and others' unwillingness to consider this aspect of how things should be in your solutions is precisely why they continue to exacerbate current issues by perpetuating hypocrisies and weakening the integrity of the conversation, ultimately moving us further and further away from our agreed upon vision of how things should be. But for now, let's move on, because you did make an extremely valid point a little bit later.
And how it is the reality that it's not, to an extent, there is merit in the idea that if you see yourself represented a certain way, so to speak, you see people that look like you, act like you, whatever, represented in a certain way, it might encourage you to do things similar to those characters and make a positive change.
So here you are affirming my point, which I thank you for, because acknowledging the arguments of the other side is crucial to creating an environment for civil disagreement. And yeah, so the point that I was making and provided evidence for was that one of the main purposes of representation was to allow these represented groups to see themselves in these characters, and how this is problematic because it reinforces the idea that you need to see someone that resembles you in some capacity in order to relate to them. But as you rightfully point out,
this is only looking at one side. See, it's not just about, do you feel like you can relate to these characters? One of the big things that gets glossed over in this conversation is the importance of representation, not just for yourself, but for other people.
And you're 100% right. This is an aspect of the representation ideal that I didn't touch on in this video. In the video I made before this one, I did allude to this aspect of the purpose of representation. Although, to be fair, I didn't dive too deeply into this concept. And so if you take a human being and you force them to understand that they are different and that those differences will limit their endeavors in some way, shape, or form, and then you reinforce that difference every day of their lives with no chance of them escaping the reality of being different, then it makes sense why that person might deem it valuable to have a powerful tool like media represent the thing that makes them different, so that they can be viewed and perceived in contexts that aren't typical to the ones that people generally associate with the trait that makes them different. So I showed this just to confirm that I do agree with what Christian is saying here. Representation isn't only about allowing the affected groups to see themselves in these characters. It's also about portraying these representative characters in a positive light so that the wider audience can perceive them in contexts that were previously inconceivable. But yeah, this is absolutely an aspect of this conversation that I completely glossed over in this video. However, this aspect of representation still does not address the aforementioned problem that you and I agree exists. The inclusion of this objective of representation into the discussion doesn't change the fact that the mission is still to use media's undue power to influence the masses into thinking differently about the affected groups. I understand that this undue power is now being used in what you would call a positive fashion, and I'll explain the reason that I emphasized you here in part 2 of this video. However, the underlying issue is that this power is still being utilized and not deconstructed entirely, which again is what we've agreed needs to happen. So let's actually use your personal experience as a case study for these solutions. At around the 7-minute mark, you say,
I naturally have reddish brownish hair. I'm naturally very pale, and I am often referred to, or was growing up especially referred to, as a ginger. Now, while growing up, I looked up to characters like, say, Drake Bell or John Stamos in his portrayal of Jesse Katsopoulos from Full House. While I looked up to characters like these and saw myself in characters like this is what the media portrayed gingers as. This kind of concept, and it didn't help the fact that I was, a little bit heavy-set at the time too, but this concept of this kind of character, this caricature more or less of a ginger, is something that I was very much saddled with for much of my life throughout middle school and high school. While this in no way compares to people who are discriminated racially and such, this is an experience that I can share in which I can relate to this matter.
So just to be clear, he is in no way comparing the plight of being a redhead to the plight of belonging to a minority that used to be slaves in this country. So please don't misconstrue what he's saying here. He is only saying that he also used to be judged as an individual by the characteristics of the caricatures that resembled him in popular media. And if we go with your solution, which is positive representation, we essentially use the agreed upon undue power of the media to influence people into thinking that gingers can actually be perceived in a much wider range of contexts. And I do not deny that this will yield some benefits for some people, ones that it seems you personally experienced, as you expressed how you were able to relate to some of the more modern, positive representations of gingers, like Cameron Monaghan and KJ Apa. And again, I'll explain why I'm putting positive in quotations in part 2. But on the other hand, the solution I presented would discourage people from forming their opinions of real-life individuals based off of media representations of those people in the first place, and would simultaneously contribute to creating the world that you and I agree should exist. Meaning that if this solution was in place, you would have never been compared to the gingers have souls meme, and you wouldn't need Cameron Monaghan and KJ Apa to be positive representations of your community to teach people and yourself what you could attain in life. And the reason I believe so strongly that this world is attainable is because I lived it. In the same video where I acknowledged this ulterior objective of representation, I explained how during my childhood, despite often being the only black kid in most contexts, my identity still wasn't reduced to being the black kid. I wasn't forced to take on the stereotypes, both positive and negative, that the media perpetuated about black people, because I was in a community of people that were able to divest those influences from their perceptions of me. For the most part, I wasn't forced to take on any black stereotypes until I got to high school. And yes, being forced to be the black kid definitely affected my image of myself and completely changed my entire mode of being. And I not only accepted my role as just another member of the black community, but I actively reinforced the notion. But that's a different story for a different video. But at least up until middle school, my coaches, my teachers, my teammates, and my friends never treated me as just another black kid. They treated me as an individual. And if posting these videos about representation has taught me anything, it's that at the very least, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who already think and feel the same way about this issue, and are able to divest media's influence from their perceptions and think of people as individuals and not as representations of their communities. And this only reinforces the notion that how things should be is actually a very attainable goal, despite the reality that you propose and that I agree with you on, that according to the way things actually are, most people don't think this way, at least according to the public discourse currently surrounding these issues. Yes, I agree with you that what I experienced isn't indicative of how most people think, but having lived in both worlds and having taken years to try to divest myself from media's influence over my perceptions of real world individuals, which by the way is 100% an ongoing process. I am in no way saying that I have achieved this goal. In any case, because of these things, I do stand by my belief that this is an achievable reality. And I am convinced that it would be extremely freeing for people if they didn't constantly have to act as ambassadors for what they are, and were instead allowed to be who they are, regardless of their external features. And so in comparing these solutions, the positive representation angle absolutely does yield some benefits for some people, and it would be disingenuous to deny that. However, the difference between these solutions is that, as discussed, in your own words, positive representation actively disregards the how things should be aspect of the discussion, and in so doing, actively pushes us farther and farther away from this agreed upon ideal by perpetuating the hypocrisies that you and I agree are being propagated, e.g. the media's undue influence on our perceptions, the extremely problematic notion that you need to see someone who resembles you in order to relate to them, the rules for thee but not for me mentality, etc. Whereas in the solution that I've presented, which again isn't really mine per se, we simultaneously address how things actually are and move in the direction of how things should be. Again, according to you, me, and at the very least hundreds of thousands of other people. And again, with this solution, we will see an increase in diverse storytelling. But of course, it'll be due to a very different motivation, one that isn't inherently hypocritical and dangerous. So in my opinion, this is the crux of our disagreement, and I feel like I could probably leave things here. But again, this is an hour and 24-minute long video, and so there are some points made later on that I would like to address that don't necessarily tie in with the main discussion. And so as discussed, that is the end of part 1 of this video, and we are now about to enter part 2, where I will basically just be looking at some individual statements and responding to those directly. Some of those statements still tie into the main discussion, but obviously there are some points that don't really have much to do with the larger discussion around representation. But anyway, with all that said, let's just get into part 2. Alright, so moving on, I wanted to discuss this point that Christian made about positive representation. This is why I was putting an emphasis on you and positive in part 1 of this video.
Okay, here's another example. People with glasses. For the longest time, people with glasses were always depicted as these nerdy people and all these different things. So you had people in real life who would just like, you'd have women that wouldn't want to date guys with glasses. You'd have the typical nerd character being the ones with glasses, all these different things. Now, because of positive depiction of them in media, people who wear glasses are actually considered attractive. The appropriate depiction of people in media is extremely important, and more so the positive depiction is more so important rather than people just being represented at all. I would argue it would be better for these groups, for groups of people to not be represented at all rather than to be represented negatively. The best thing is to represent them positively, but what I'm saying is it does more harm to have negative representation than to have no representation at all. And I think that that's the point that even Fief is missing here, unfortunately. Though I do think he makes good points in general.
Okay, so first things first, I think the glasses example is valid. I push back a little, but only because in this case, and in almost all cases, positive representation is akin to any portrayal that results in that group having a wider audience find them physically attractive. And I think this only reinforces our society's obsession with physical attractiveness, which I could ultimately deem as harmful messaging. However, to be fair to him, this is the reality of the situation. And so by his and society's current metric, this could definitely be classified as positive representation. Although again, just as in part 1 of this video, I think that if we shifted our paradigms, this could easily be seen as negative. In any case, the first thing I want to address is the claim that this is a point that I'm missing. Although I don't really see how that is valid since I directly acknowledged what Christian is talking about at the beginning of this video. It seems like the problem is that the minority communities in this country believe that for far too long, we have been represented in the media as archetypical, stereotypical caricatures of the types of people that actually exist within our community. The claim is that seeing ourselves constantly relegated to the side characters who never achieve the glory that the main characters achieve creates a negative feedback loop, which discourages the people within these communities from ever even striving to achieve those heights. And so the push for representation is a push for these communities to see themselves as the heroes, the bosses, the love interests, etc., so that we can begin to understand that we are just as capable of achieving these heights as the heroes that we've typically seen on the big screen. I understand that Christian's video was originally recorded as a stream, and as such, it's very easy to miss or overlook certain things because streams are recorded live, and that adds a whole other pressure-filled dynamic to making videos, as opposed to someone like me who writes out an entire script beforehand. But in any case, I did just want to clarify that the point that he's making about positive and negative representation was originally addressed. The second and most important aspect of this claim that I wanted to address, and the reason that I emphasized you and positive when speaking about positive representation in part 1, is the discussion around what actually is positive representation and what is negative representation. Recently, a black woman by the name of Courtney Michelle posted a TikTok about how the representation in Black Panther Wakanda Forever was inadequate, and she doesn't believe that the movie appropriately represented her as a black woman or African culture in general.
But all the women that was in the movie was just brolic, built, strong Hercules. What is this saying to us? And this movie does not represent what African culture is. It doesn't represent what our culture needs to be. So, nah, I'm good on Wakanda.
Now, full disclosure, I haven't seen this movie. And based off of her video, I don't personally believe that I would agree with her perspectives, even if I had.
What up, Editor Fief here. So a couple of days after I recorded this, I did end up watching Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and no, I did not enjoy it. However, I still don't necessarily agree with Courtney Michelle's perspective here. Regardless, as I'm about to indicate, whether I agree with her or not isn't really the point. But anyway, I just wanted this to be as up to date as possible. So now that that's out of the way, let's just get back to the video.
However, the fact remains that she is a black woman who doesn't believe that the black representation was in any way positive. And for this opinion, her video was deleted from TikTok. And so the question becomes, whose representation actually matters? What is positive to you may be negative to someone else. I've now made 2 videos deconstructing past female characters and arguing that they were strong, even though they weren't physically imposing figures fighting off bad guys and taking down supervillains. And to my surprise, I received a plethora of comments from women explaining how the modern strong female character doesn't represent them and is actively harmful because it conveys the message that in order for women to be strong, they essentially need to behave like men. And so I ask again, whose representation matters. Because as these examples demonstrate, one person's positive representation is another person's negative representation. And this is an aspect of this discussion that I believe many who support the positive representation solution are either intentionally neglecting or simply haven't considered, because they believe that their idea of positive representation is the idea of positive representation. And everybody who disagrees with their perspective needs to be silenced, like Courtney Michelle was. And so this is why I was putting air quotes around positive, because in many instances, positive is subjective. In any case, I've already spent way too much time on this topic, so we're gonna keep it moving because there is still a lot to get to. And to me, this argument just sounds like we're basically seeking to use this undue power for our own good, instead of addressing the root cause and stripping this tool of its power in the first place. Remember?
Okay, I think this comes to a fundamental misunderstanding of this whole concept with media and power and all this stuff in general. If power exists, if systems must exist in a way, then they should be for the benefit of people. We can argue all day long that, oh, it shouldn't be this way, it shouldn't be that way, yeah, whatever. The reality is, the world that you consume through media, be that fictional or otherwise, is just as real to many people as the world out. There are many people, I would say less so now, but there are many people, especially in like the rural South, for example, where their only real exposure to minorities, racial, sexual, anything, is media.
Okay, so you said that the world that people consume through media is just as real to them as the actual real world, and that if power must exist, then it must be used to the benefit of the people, right? And you go on to say that this is a fundamental misunderstanding that I hold, but just as with the last claim that was made alleging that I was missing something, I don't really see any indications in your arguments that I've misunderstood this concept. Only this declaration that I have without any real evidence supporting it. Again, throughout my last two videos, and even in this one, I have acknowledged this reality and factored it into the solution that I've presented. In my opinion, the fundamental misunderstanding on display here is the acknowledgement of the underlying problem only to present a solution that actively disregards it. You acknowledge that the media holds undue influence over our lives. You acknowledge that our actual realities are shaped by that undue influence. And you acknowledge that it should not be this way. But then you present a solution that ignores these acknowledgements and seeks to use that undue power to your own benefit, while simultaneously condemning this power. In any case, after this next clip, we're going to circle back around to that "if power must exist" quote. I feel like we need to destroy this power and not try to use it for ourselves. Because when you don't address the root cause of an issue and you only attack the symptoms, you tend to do more harm than good, and you might actually end up exacerbating already existing issues while allowing the real problem to grow and fester. And
I agree with this, but the problem is the Lord of the Rings and anything else where you're destroying something at the source by literally physically destroying it, that's fine for something that's physical, like the ring in the Lord of the Rings. But in real life, when you have this systemic and cultural issue, you don't destroy it by just like blowing up a machine that controls all the data or something. You destroy it by changing the minds of people. And that's what the point of the positive representation is.
Kind of touched on some.
This is us destroying it.
Okay, so no, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna push back vehemently on this point. Because by your own words, this is definitively not you destroying this power. This is you using it. You just said, if power must exist, then it must be used to the benefit of the people. Which is you directly acknowledging that, yes, this power exists, a power which, again, you have already condemned, and acquiescing to the notion that since it already exists, all we can do is use it to help the people. So continuing with the Lord of the Rings analogy, you've taken the ring, aka this condemnable power, you've concluded that it must exist without earnestly exploring any viable solutions to destroy it, which you've then taken to mean that the only available option to us is to use it for ourselves. So I just want to be very clear here that no, this is not you attempting to destroy this power. Again, by your own rhetoric, this is you trying to take this power and use it, which was one of the main points of my original video. And of course, I understand that there's no racism machine that we can just blow up and end all of this discrimination. But that doesn't inherently mean that there are no avenues available to us to destroy this power. Again, the solution that I presented in no way falls victim to that illusion. It acknowledges that power and seeks to, as you put it, change the minds of the people who don't believe that this power can be destroyed in the first place. But again, I've said way too much here, so let's just get to the next point. it. There's just a sentiment that more is better, even though percentage-wise, Hollywood already pretty much matches up with the real-world demographics, at least for black and white people. And yet the calls for more representation ensue.
All right, I'm going to point out something here. This is getting on my nerves a little bit. Have you ever tried to search for something on Netflix or anything else? Comic books, video game characters, musical artists, anything. And you're trying to find specifically black people, Latin people, some other race that isn't white. It's very easy, because, and I did this, and I thought this and bought into this for a long time. When you are either not paying attention or you're so focused on only the white people that you notice when the minorities come in, oh, this is some like virtue signaling. And sometimes it is, and we'll get to that. Do you know how hard it is to actually find positive representation of people of color? The reality is, the representation isn't there.
Okay, so the reason I brought up statistics is because the discussion around representation isn't only concerned with bringing subjectively positive representation into the media, but also seeks to legitimize the claim that there needs to be more representation in the media. And in that sense, you are inadvertently proving my point here. Because when you say the reality is that the representation isn't there, the actual reality is that this is only a reflection of your own personal experience. Because statistically speaking, black people are equally represented in Hollywood and are actually overrepresented on TV. So when people clamor for more representation, this is the question I ask. What does more mean? Will we be satisfied when Christian Verstappen can go on Netflix and see a comparable number of black female protagonists to white male protagonists? Again, I don't know the answer to this question, and I'm not even saying that I would inherently be upset if we did occupy the same amount of space. So please don't misunderstand my intent behind asking this question. All I'm saying is that as long as there is no definitive objective from this movement, then as I said in my first video on representation, this goal only exists subjectively in the minds of those who seek more of it, as you just confirmed. And so I think that it's fair to question what the objective end goal is here. When we talk about more, what does more mean? Additionally, I'm not sure if you're referring to me specifically or speaking more generally, but just to clarify, I never indicate that I immediately assume virtue signaling whenever I see a new story with a minority playing the lead role, because I don't. And on that note,
and the reality is that as much as, let's be real, conservatives want to cry about how it's everywhere, it really isn't. It's actually very difficult to find, even if you're looking for it. It's just that when you're not looking for it and or you don't want it, this sticks out.
Again, I'm not sure if you're talking about me specifically or just speaking generally here, but I just want to clarify that I do not identify as a conservative, just as I do not identify as a liberal or a centrist or any of these other labels. The nature of our discourse makes it acceptable for people to assume that if someone takes a stance opposite to your own, then that must mean that they play for the other team. But I find this method of discussion to be entirely counterproductive. In my opinion, these blanket statements only serve to deepen the divide and push people further into the extremes. There are countless videos of people blaming this very mentality for why they left the left or why they had to abandon the Republican Party, demonstrating that this ideological purism is only exacerbating the issue. I know this was a bit of a side tangent, but I really felt the need to address this because of the wider implications. But anyway, on to the next clip. There's also the issue of creating stories and characters specifically for individual groups and demographics, and how that inherently excludes everybody who doesn't fall into your target audience and discourages them from engaging with your story, resulting in...
So I get what he's saying, but here's what I'm going to say. I don't think if you take something like, we'll go back to She's Gotta Have It, or Family Matters, or Everybody Hates Chris, or any of these things where black people are the primary focus, for example, or Miss Marvel, where they showed off a lot of culture from, I'm going to butcher this, some kind of Islam, if I am getting that correct. I don't remember, I apologize. But in any case, what you are doing is you are introducing people like myself who would otherwise be unfamiliar with that stuff. You're introducing us to a whole new world, a whole new culture, a whole new type of people.
Okay, so I think that there may be a bit of a misunderstanding here. I'm not saying that any story featuring black or non-white characters will make it hard for white people to relate to them. I'm specifically talking about representation characters, aka characters created for the explicit purpose of representing a specific demographic, like the black version of Batwoman and Ironheart. The point I'm making is that once you declare that this character is for these people, inherent in that statement is the exclusion of everybody who doesn't fit that description. Family Matters and Everybody Hates Chris were definitively not made with that intent. So yeah, I hope that clears things up. In those stories flopping or getting canceled because they didn't have enough support. And lastly,
all I can say about this, and you know what, actually, so I don't know anything about Batwoman season 4, but I can tell you, by the way, a black Batwoman was not the issue with Batwoman. The issue with the Batwoman TV series was the preaching.
I need you to fix his suit.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be. When it fits a woman.
Now, I don't know, it just feels very preachy. It feels like, it feels like that very preachy, woke scoldy type of feminism, and not really gender equality, but almost a flipping of the scripts kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think you definitely have a point that there were plenty of other reasons as to why Batwoman was canceled. And I agree with the issues you've raised, but I don't think you can definitively claim that the fact that she was race swapped didn't play a part in people tuning out. Also, I think it's important to note that the very same feeling that turned you away from the Batwoman series is the exact same feeling that turns people away from the representation ideal. Your claims about feeling preached to are exactly the same feelings that the people who are tired of representation are expressing. Except in your case, you're saying that this doesn't really feel like it's about gender equality, and I'm going to infer here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that what you mean by flipping of the script is that what this felt like was closer to gender superiority, essentially denigrating Batman to prop up Batwoman. Change gender for race here, and boom, now you know exactly what the people who are speaking out against representation are feeling, especially as we endorse a solution that promotes the rules for thee but not for me hypocrisy, which, on that note, and lastly, there is the hypocrisy of the representation ideal. Because if we get so up in arms about whitewashing, which, just to be clear, I think is justifiable, I think we should be upset with that. But that means that we can't turn the other cheek when we witness blackwashing.
I agree with this. Put simply, I hate double standards. Like, I don't care. I know some people will justify it and all kind of different. I don't give a rules for me, not for thee is super cringe. It does not lead to positive anything at the end of the day.
So I thought it was important to show this because it demonstrates that Christian wasn't just here to win a debate. It seems like he was genuinely trying to engage with my points and determine where and why he either agreed or disagreed with what I was saying. And I can only hope that I've done the same in my response. But in any case, let's keep going.
My take on this, just real quick, and we'll get into it as the video continues here. This is fine. This is fine. And so is this. These are both fine. That's my take, all right? We'll get to it in a bit here, but my take is race swapping, gender swapping, whatever the hell you want to do. I don't give a f***. These are things of fiction.
So I'm glad that we agree that it's hypocritical to allow one and not the other. But I do disagree that it's all okay, especially when the reason is because it's fiction. I think artistic integrity is important, and also, I think it's a little disrespectful to the fans of an IP to just change something about a character that they've grown an attachment to, simply because the new artist wants to come into the space and fulfill an agenda. I also think that in a lot of high fiction, like The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, thoughtlessly throwing different races into the mix invalidates the meticulous world building that was done by the original authors, which ultimately ends up breaking the immersion of the audience. But this is a different topic entirely, so I'm just gonna leave it here for now. But I do think that when we adapt stories, we should always try to remain as faithful to the source material as possible. Anyway, moving on.
It's fine. It's let people make art the way they want to make art. It's whatever. It's fine.
Okay, I know I said I was done with this, but I just want to address what you said here, because this is precisely the issue. This isn't their art. They're not making it. They are co-opting the art of other artists and using it as a vehicle to spread their own messages. Sure, make your art however you wish, but I don't believe any of us have the right to hijack another artist's work and change how it was originally imagined for our own purposes.
Yeah, real quick, by the way, hot take with anime. Everyone's gonna hate me, especially when it comes to anime. Dubs over subs. I don't give a f***. If I want to read a book, I'm going to read a book. If I want to watch a movie or a TV show, I'm going to watch a movie or a TV show.
Honestly, out of everything in this video, this part offended me the most. Nah, I'm sorry, bro, but it is subs over dubs all day, every day. Watch the art in its original language as the artists envisioned it. Everybody in the world already has to learn to speak our language. The least we can do is watch their TV shows in their own language, while still having the privilege of reading it in our own. Okay, I'm joking, but I'm not. But I'm joking. In any case, it's really not that deep. Do what makes you happy. But like I said, it's sub gang for life. The reality is that Motoko's Asianness is completely irrelevant to the story, seeing
The only way you could say that it matters, by the way, is their name. But especially, and I've never seen Ghost in the Shell, so I don't know this for a fact, but I believe it's like super far in the future. It's like a cyberpunk. Oh, by the way, the Netflix cyberpunk series was amazing.
okay, redeemed yourself a little bit here. Netflix is Cyberpunk and also the actual game, if you actually got a chance to play it, were both incredible. But anyway, let's get back to the important stuff.
But the first weekend, that's for us. To do anything other than this is anti-black.
Okay, just real quick, identity politics, virtue signaling, so much cringe that turns people off from the left and progressivism, and so much that the right loves to use to say, oh, look, this is how these progressive people are. No. Most people were not being like this woman. The important thing to know about this instance is that while it's super cringe, she is a minority in her stance on this matter.
Okay, so I agree. This woman's take is not representative of the left, and portraying her as such was not my intention. Especially because, as I've said, I try not to play into the whole right versus left debate. As I outlined in my original video, the reason I used her as an example was to demonstrate the logical progression of the philosophy of the representation ideal. Again, if you tell people that certain characters are for them, if you allow for the mentality of rules for thee but not for me to fester, and if you refuse to set objective parameters around what you hope to achieve, then it makes complete sense that out of that concoction of hypocrisy, this kind of take would manifest. Of course, I acknowledge and concede that her perspective isn't indicative of the entire representation movement. However, what I was trying to demonstrate by using her as an example is that the rot lies in the thought process itself. A thought process that essentially leads to a pro-segregation argument, but this time in favor of black people, which to me is the smoking gun that clearly illustrates that we're not trying to destroy the tools of our oppressors. We're trying to use them for ourselves. But anyway, on to the next clip. And more importantly, it simply doesn't address the root cause of the problem, which is, in my opinion, the myriad of socioeconomic policies that continue to keep minority groups isolated and trapped in poverty, resulting in these communities being forced to resort to certain behaviors just to survive or make it out. In my opinion, that is the internal bleeding that needs to be addressed here. It doesn't—
He's correct. But that's not the point of this video.
I'm sorry, but no, that quite literally is the point of this video. The fact that representation doesn't address these systemic issues at all. Hence, we bleed internally while chasing this dubious ideal that, in my opinion, will ultimately fail to heal us. And that brings us to your next point. It doesn't matter if a young black boy living in the inner city sees a TV show about doctors where the lead is a black man and decides to become a doctor himself if he doesn't have access to the tools that would allow him to achieve that dream in the first place.
But if that lead doctor is seen by other people, especially white people who already have the power to, say, give him the ability, the schooling, the anything to be a doctor, then that representation is good and important. And that's why it matters. That's why it's important. There have been studies on this where people with, say, black-sounding names are less likely to get callbacks on applications than people with white-sounding names. Positive representation is one of the myriad of things that could go toward resolving that type of issue.
Okay, so I'm gonna split this response into two parts. First, let's talk about the young boy, because I don't think that the process that you're outlining here has much real-world applicability. And I don't think that it actually ties into the second point that you made, which, by the way, is completely valid. The first claim that you're making is that a white person who is in a position of power might see a black doctor on TV and decide to personally invest into impoverished black communities in order to encourage youth in these neighborhoods to become doctors. That process occurring isn't really corroborated by any real-world evidence. evidence. It is far more likely that white people and other minorities in positions of power will invest into these communities after witnessing injustices take place in them, not after seeing positive representations of minorities in media. BLM garnered support and investment after bringing widespread attention to the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Gardner, not because they created a TV show with a black president. Positive representation has two discernible effects corroborated by evidence. First, that young black boy will see that black doctor, which could potentially encourage him to believe that he could become a doctor as well. And that just brings us back to my original point, because if he doesn't have the tools to achieve that dream, then that positive representation is ultimately inconsequential. And the second effect is exactly what you highlighted, which, as you noted, is supported by evidence. So for example, let's say Darius and Jerome, which are stereotypically black names, are doctors on a popular TV show. Sure, white people that are exposed to that TV show may start to destigmatize those names over time thanks to that exposure. I don't disagree with you there. But again, and I know I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but my point is, what if from the beginning those white people understood that those names aren't stigmatized? What if they could watch a TV show where Darius and Jerome are criminals, and then the next day they see either a Darius or Jerome on a job application and not immediately think that these people are likely to be criminals because the last people they saw with those names were criminals on a TV show? I just think that that is a much healthier reality to aim for. One where we apply critical thought and disallow the mainstream media from making decisions for us. But let's keep going because we're getting close to the end now.
I disagree with this mindset that's almost, we should only do things at the political level and shouldn't worry about anything at the cultural level, because each feed into each other.
So I know I already addressed this, but I never claimed that we shouldn't focus on things at the cultural level. And the solution that I've been presenting since my first video on this topic directly addresses the cultural changes that I think we should be making. I do not deny that more diversity in storytelling will facilitate an environment where better, more interesting, never-before-seen stories can thrive. And so I advocate for different stories to be told, featuring different types of people from all over the world. In any case, this brings us to your solution.
Okay. My solution to all this, I think it's a lot simpler than some people make it out to be. Really what it comes down to at the end of the day is the positive representation is important, and the virtue signally cringy turns everybody off. So don't do that. Do the representation, do the positive representation, but don't do it cringy. Don't virtue signal about it. Don't go on these media campaigns about how, oh, we're so brave for having a black person or a gay person or a trans person or a not able-bodied. I don't know what the right, you know what I mean though. We're so brave for having this person. Like, no, don't do that. Put them in the show, put them in the movie, put them in the video game, and then, and represent them positively. And then, if you have conservatives freaking out like the Quartering and people like that, and news outlets and all this, you turn to them and you say, what's your problem? Like, they ask, oh, you made them gay for a political statement. No, it just seemed like it fit the character. What are you talking about? I wrote the character and it seemed, oh yeah, they're gay. They would have a boyfriend. Or, oh, they're gay, they would have a girlfriend. Like, okay. Or, hey, they're not really into relationships at all. They're ace, or they're arrow, or they're arrow ace, or whatever, right? You do the things without the virtue signaling.
So essentially, just to paraphrase, the solution that you've presented is to keep moving forward with positive representation, but to cease all of the virtue signaling that has come along with it. And sure, I will admit that I believe that this would definitely be an improvement. I think your solution does have some viability to it. If you stop all the press tour preaching about how necessary and important it was to include these characters, I do think that it would make it a lot easier for certain groups to swallow what the media was putting out. However, and this is the last time I'll say this, I promise, this solution doesn't address the underlying issues that we agree need to be addressed. It doesn't address media's undue influence on our perceptions of people. It doesn't address the fact that representation reinforces the idea that you need to see someone who resembles you in some capacity in order to relate to them. It doesn't address the inherent hypocrisy of the rules for thee but not for me mentality. It doesn't address the inherent subjectivity of positive versus negative representation. It doesn't address the complete lack of an objective end goal. And perhaps most importantly, it doesn't address the systemic issues that still plague these communities. And seeing as it fails to address all of these issues while exacerbating pre-existing dilemmas, I still don't see it as a viable solution to achieving an equal and/or equitable society. I think it patently misunderstands human psychology and seeks to use the power of past oppressors for itself in a misguided attempt to achieve equitability, while villainizing and demonizing any group that calls out its hypocrisies. And so ultimately, again, I think that Christian's solution would be a step in a direction that I do believe would be an improvement on our current reality. But I still don't think that it is the solution that will once and for all dismantle the ingrained systemic and societal pillars that continue to disadvantage minority communities. But in any case, I think that's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, thank you so much for indulging me. There were a few more points that I wanted to address, but they were entirely inconsequential to the larger discussion. But again, I just want to send out a genuine, heartfelt thank you to Christian for taking the time to go through my entire video and critique it. I know we don't agree, but for me at least, having the opportunity to defend my thesis was invaluable. And I'm just thankful that it was someone like Christian who decided to speak on my video. Because it could have been someone who just wanted to win a debate or start some internet beef, because that is also extremely prevalent on this website and on the internet in general. And so again, thank you to Christian. I hope I didn't misrepresent you in this. And of course, if you have the time, please go and check out his original video so that you can get the full context of his argument. Obviously, it's going to be linked in the description. In any case, as always, I hope this made sense, but if it didn't, please feel free to let me know so that I can try to address any misconceptions in the comments. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one. Peace. As you can see, it is now dark outside. It is currently 5:45 p.m. I started filming today at 11:30. My camera died 3 times because my camera is 12 years old. Anyway, my point is just that I am probably never going to make a response video like this ever again. Way too much work. Just way too much work. Next time, I'll just leave a comment. Anyway, peace. Because acknowledging the arguments of the other side is crucial to creating an environment for civil disagreement. Wow. Wow. Okay. Puberty. I'm 31 years old, still haven't finished puberty.